give this a check.
Okay. Testing. There we go. Okay.
The interior of the bar is great.
You know, when my husband was at the place where they did the sermon, he said that Jesus must have been at the bottom because it was like a natural amphitheater.
I think I've heard that. Yeah.
That's what their guide told them because it was just, but I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Probably started out at the top.
Yeah. Okay. Can y'all hear me all right? Good. Okay, let's get started. So, this is the last of our World of the Bible series, and today I'm gonna be talking about the world of Jesus's passion and death and resurrection, and then talk a little bit about the spread of the early church. So for anybody who missed the earlier lectures, and for anybody who doesn't know me, I'm John Harmon, and I'm a member here at First Methodist Weatherford, and I'm a doctoral candidate in ancient Near Eastern archaeology with a background in history and biblical studies, and so I've been taking that perspective to work through the whole Bible to kind of provide the social and cultural background of the biblical narratives. And so for anybody who's new, welcome, and for anybody who has been here through the whole series, I greatly appreciate your interest. So, this talk is going to be kind of a combination of historical geography and the kind of things that you might hear on a good Holy Land tour, kind of accented and punctuated with some archaeology information. And so last time we ended with Jesus's trial before Pilate, and Pilate's condemnation of him, his reluctant condemnation of Jesus to execution by crucifixion. And that leads into something that you can still experience in Jerusalem today if you ever visit. There's kind of a pilgrim trail that commemorates Jesus' passion and death and resurrection, and it's called the Via Dolorosa, or the Stations of the Cross. And there are 14 stations. I won't go through them all, but if you're interested, you can look it up later and read more about it. But it starts with Jesus' trial. And if you remember back to last week when I talked about the possible locations of the trial, it looks like this. It looks like the Stations of the Cross assumes that the trial took place in the Antonia Fortress, just off the Temple Mount. And that's a plausible location. And certainly I like to honor traditions, but I think historically it's equally likely that the trial could have taken place at the Royal Palace on the other side of the city. But you can go back to last week if you want more information on that. But this little pilgrim trail through Jerusalem commemorates the trial and Jesus carrying the cross, and everything that happened between there and his crucifixion and internment at the Holy Sepulchre. So that's just a cool continuing tradition that you can still experience if you ever go there. So now, turning to the crucifixion, Jesus was nailed to a cross, at least according. Interestingly, the gospel accounts don't mention that he was nailed to the cross. It just says generically that he was crucified, or at least the crucifixion accounts. Later in the Gospels, it specifies that he was nailed, especially through the story with St. Thomas and his asking to see the scars of the nails. That's a really interesting detail, and the early church saw it as fulfilling scriptural prophecy, the piercing of the hands and feet. But it's actually rather unusual historically, because crucifixion was a common Roman method of execution, but people were typically tied to a cross rather than nailed. Nailing seems to have been very rare, to the extent that some people have questioned the historicity of the gospel accounts for exactly that reason, because it was so rare that some people have questioned whether it would even be possible for nails to hold a person's weight through the hands and the feet without tearing through the flesh. But now we do have some archaeological confirmation of nails being used in crucifixion. This was the ankle bone of a Jewish man who was crucified in Judea, close to the time of Jesus. No direct connection, but obvious evidence of nails being used in crucifixion. Another example was found, I believe, in Italy, and to my knowledge, those are the only two examples of nails being used in crucifixion. But it certainly happened, based on this evidence. So if you ever hear anyone doubting the veracity of the Gospels for this reason, you can tell them that we have evidence now that really was a practice. And so that's interesting. So, of course, as we know from the Gospel stories, Jesus is crucified, and he gives up his spirit, and the curtain of the temple is torn into, indicating that Jesus is the ultimate sacrifice and the fulfillment of the old covenant. And so then, after he dies, his body is taken down from the cross, prepared for burial, and then buried in a rock-cut tomb belonging to Joseph of Arimathea, who seems to have been one of his followers, and was apparently a wealthy man. And the Gospel of John notes that the tomb was near a garden, and that no one had been buried there before. It was a brand new, unused tomb. And so all that will be relevant to evaluating the different claims of sites of his crucifixion and burial. Another detail is it notes that he was buried outside the walls of the city. And so here on the map you can see the two traditional locations of the crucifixion and burial. The bottom arrow, the black arrow, points towards the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, And the top arrow points towards what's called Gordon's Calvary, which is associated with a site sometimes called the Garden Tomb. And you might notice that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is within the walls of the current city. And so that's weird. If that's the traditional site and the tomb is supposed to be outside the city, well, then something isn't adding up. And so that has led some people to favor the Garden Tomb. And so I'm going to talk about the various reasons for the two respective sites. So which one is it? The left image shows the tomb of the Holy Sepulchre, and the right is the outside of the Garden Tomb. And I'm going to start with the Garden Tomb. And it emerged as a theory or as a potential location, as far as we can tell, sometime in the mid-1800s, maybe the 1830s, maybe the 1840s. But it was in the 1880s that Major General Charles Gordon popularized this idea. And so it's often called Gordon's Calvary for that reason. And so the theory started with people noticing this hill on the north side of Jerusalem that looks rather like a skull. You can see the two eye sockets and something maybe like a mouth. And so people started noticing this hill and its resemblance to a skull, and they began to associate it with Golgotha. And so I'm going to continue on with the other evidence surrounding this location, but I'm going to talk just a little bit about Major General Gordon for two reasons. First, I find this quote really illuminating, and this kind of represents what you might call the aesthetic reason for favoring this tomb. Because many Protestants are uncomfortable with the smells and bells that they sometimes call it of the high church style, the incense and the ceremonies and the elaborate garb and the rituals that seem complicated and alienating. And so a lot of Protestants are turned off by that. And part of the appeal of the Garden Tomb is that it doesn't have any of that. And that's expressed here by General Gordon rather beautifully, I think. And I'm going to take just a couple minutes to talk about him because he's really interesting. You might know him from history as Chinese Gordon or Khartoum Gordon, because he was a British Army general who served in China and Sudan and had quite an illustrious career. One of his laudable accomplishments was he was instrumental in ending slavery in Sudan. And ultimately, he was killed defending the city of Khartoum. Quite an interesting guy with quite a long and varied career. And there's a movie about his role in the siege of Khartoum. Charlton Heston plays General Gordon, and it's pretty good. Like I'm not enough of an authority on the history to say whether or not the movie is really historically accurate, but it's worth a watch. And I just thought that was worth going into briefly because of interesting career and his connection to the Garden Tomb. But now we'll return to Jerusalem. And so I talked about how that cliff looked like a skull, and so many people began to associate it with Golgotha. Well, that first picture was taken in maybe the 1880s or so. This was taken, I took this picture about 10 years ago. And so this gives you an idea of what it looks like now. And now the angle's not quite the same, and it's not quite as effective for seeing that skull-like shape. But even here you can see that that shape doesn't really exist anymore. It doesn't really look like a skull anymore, even 140 years later. And so we should be really cautious about assuming that it would have looked like a skull 2,000 years ago. So I'm skeptical about that part. It's cool when you can observe the landscape and make connections with ancient stories, but you have to be really careful about that. But I also talked about the Garden Tomb, because when people started associating this hill with Calvary, they started looking in the area for a candidate for Jesus' tomb, and they found one. And it looks very much the way people imagine the tomb to look, a rock-hewn tomb with a track that looks like you would roll a stone in it to seal it, like the Gospels said. And so a lot of people jumped on this and said, well, this must be the tomb. And most Holy Land tours will visit this site along with the Holy Sepulchre. And sometimes it's taught as if this is for sure the tomb. And I'm not at all convinced that it is, kind of unfortunately. I say unfortunately because it's a beautiful site. And when you're in Jerusalem, it's busy and it's crowded and it's hectic and it can be overwhelming. And this is a beautiful little oasis in a fairly dry, fairly barren, very foreign to us and very hectic city. And you go here and it's beautiful and lush and it has this association with Jesus. But I don't think it's the real place. And but that is not to denigrate any, you might know people who had a legitimate spiritual experience here, and I don't want to denigrate that at all. You can grow close to God anywhere, and even if this isn't the tomb, God could use that to speak to people. If you have pilgrims who are turned off by the pomp and ceremony of the high church style, well, it could be very beneficial to have an alternative place to pilgrimage to, and you can have a legitimate experience with God there. As one example of talking about how people are turned off by the high church style, I have one Baptist preacher acquaintance who told me that he felt so revolted the first time he entered a Catholic or Orthodox church there that he felt physically ill. To me, that's nuts, because I love those old churches with their incense and elaborate decoration. But if you're taught to value simplicity and not value ceremony, I can see how it would be off-putting. And so that is kind of what this site serves, is an alternative to the traditional sites. And I should have gone into this more a minute ago, but the reason I say that this is almost not certainly the site is, while they did find a tomb, everyone who looks at it who knows tomb architecture has said that it's probably from the 7th or 8th century BC, which is roughly the time of Hezekiah. That's Old Testament time, long, long before Jesus. They explored further in the area, and there were more tombs, but also all of those were 7th, 8th century, Iron Age, long before Jesus' time. So this was an ancient cemetery, but it's too ancient. Another element is, as they explored this area, they found cisterns, underground water storage, and people said, well, this could be for the garden. The Bible says that there was a garden here. Obviously, you need water for a garden, and this is a dry region. So maybe these cisterns were associated with the garden. But as they explored those, most of the excavators concluded that they dated to the Crusader period. And it's possible that even the ledge that looks like where a stone would have rolled in front of the tomb, some people have interpreted that as a Crusader-era water trough for horses and other livestock at that period. And so, while it's a beautiful site for the reasons I discussed, and it's completely legitimate to have a spiritual experience there, there's no archaeological support for it. By all means, visit there if you ever go, because it is beautiful. They've replanted all these trees. They have flowers all around, and it's this beautiful, serene garden in the middle of this hectic city. So go there and sing and pray and enjoy it, but archaeologically, there's no reason to think that this was Jesus' tomb. So before you get too sad, I have better news about the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, because as I was going through the reasons that it doesn't work, you might have thought, okay, fair enough, but what about it being within the walls of the city? Because Scripture is quite clear that the crucifixion and burial were outside the city, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is inside the city walls. The garden tomb is outside. Isn't that a major point in its favor? Well, very reasonable argument, but archaeological explorations have suggested that the ancient walls were significantly different from the modern walls. The walls you see in Jerusalem today, they date from between the 5th century AD to the 15th or 16th century AD. Parts of it are even newer. A few parts are older. But by and large, the current walls of what we call the Old City in Jerusalem are significantly different from what they would have been in Jesus' time. And so while now the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is within the city in the Christian quarter, well, that quarter built up after that time. So in the Roman period, it seems to have been just outside the walls, the way it was described in the Gospels. And so here you can see a map that shows the two possible tomb locations. And again, the lower one is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and it was outside the main city walls. You can see it a little bit more clearly here, where the earlier first century city was quite a bit smaller, and it wasn't until later that it expanded out and surrounded the site of the crucifixion and burial. And so from the perspective of historical geography, both sites work, but since I have argued strongly against the Garden Tomb, I would say that historical geography favors the traditional Church of the Holy Sepulchre as the real site. And so here is a reconstruction of what some people think the landscape may have looked like. You see, just outside a city gate and a city wall, you have the little hill of Calvary, and then on the other side of a little gully, you have the tomb. And so we think that that may have roughly been what it looked like in the first century. And very interestingly, in AD 135, the Roman Emperor Hadrian, who was not a fan of Christianity, built this temple of Venus right over it. And a lot of people think that Hadrian built it specifically to prevent Christians from visiting the site that they were already venerating in the early 2nd century as the tomb of Jesus. And I'm not sure about this part, but I've heard it suggested that he may have erected a temple or a statue of Venus directly over the hill of Calvary as like a direct insult to the gospel and to Christians. And so, on the one hand, that's horrible, and that's a desecration of one of our holiest places. But from an archaeologist's perspective, it's kind of great because, one, this Roman temple preserved the ancient tomb, but it also provides additional evidence that as early as 135, which is not that long at all after the time of Jesus, this was recognized as the place of his crucifixion and burial. So I think this might be the earliest attested holy site that we can associate with Jesus. I talked in an earlier lecture about the Church of the Church of the Nativity, and I think that's probably legit too, but I don't think we really have direct evidence of that being venerated until the time of Constantine, whereas this predates Constantine by almost 200 years, so that's a big deal. And so we have this temple, this Roman pagan temple over the Holy Sepulchre, and then a couple centuries later, we have the Emperor Constantine and his mother, Empress Helena, who was Christian. And she visited here in 326 AD. And by then, Hadrian's temple was already deteriorated. But she pulled down what was left of it and discovered the Holy Sepulchre. And the hill that she linked based on the gospel stories with Calvary. And she even claims to have found the true cross, which I don't know about that. I'm always really cautious about identifying artifacts with any specific historical figure. But this one maybe works, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit more later. So Helena identified the site and explored it, found something that she thought was a cross, possibly the cross. And then her son Constantine had this church built, and it was consecrated in AD 335. And the basic footprint of that church is still mostly there, although it has been partially destroyed and rebuilt and reconfigured and added on to the point where it's really a living archaeological site in and of itself. You know, this has been a church for 1,700 years. Like, that's kind of nuts. And when you visit there, it's kind of overwhelming for that reason, which is probably a big part of why a lot of people don't like it. And a lot of people gravitated towards that garden tomb. Okay, testing. Are we back on? Okay, I'm not sure where my mic died on me, but I was saying that this church is really complicated to the point where it can be rather overwhelming. And by comparison, the garden tomb is very easy to understand. You walk in, and it's this beautiful garden, and there's a tomb, and there's a hill, and it's simple. Whereas this church is very confusing. If you don't have a guide or you don't know the site well, you wouldn't know what you're looking at. And so that's part, I think, of why a lot of people find it overwhelming or find it uninspiring and even, I don't know, even offensive. You know, you remember my Baptist friend that I talked about feeling physically ill in response to, it was either this church or the Church of the Nativity, I can't remember which, but either one, some people have a very visceral negative reaction, partly because it's so complicated. But I'm going to walk you through it briefly and help you kind of understand what's going on in this church. So you walk through the front entrance in that courtyard that you can see towards the bottom of the map. You walk through the door. Oh, wait, before we go in the church, let's start outside. Okay, we're outside the church. And this was me 10 or 15 years ago, I'm not sure when. But an interesting little story is, you see that ladder on the church facade behind me? Well, that ladder has been there for something like 180 years because, and this is the story, as I have heard it, I'm not sure if it's exactly factual, but I've heard it several times, so there's something to it. But this church is controlled by 6 different Christian groups, and they have trouble agreeing about much of anything, and they have to agree for anything to be done, anything to be changed in this church. And sometime back around 1840, some poor janitor or something left a ladder sitting on the facade of the church on the outside, and the 6 different groups had a conniption fit, apparently, and they could not agree whose ladder it was, and I think maybe the floor belonged to one group and the wall belonged to a different group, and so they couldn't agree who has either the right or the responsibility to remove the thing. And they bickered about it for so long that it kind of became part of the city. And they decided to just leave it because every picture you've ever seen of the church has that ladder because it has been there as long as we've had cameras. Um, and you see the two windows up high above the entrance? On the right window, you can just barely see it. Yeah. So yeah, that was there for about 180 years, I think, and it actually finally fell apart, and it had become such a fixture of the city that they decided to put a new one up. So, as I understand it, they couldn't agree to remove the thing, but they finally could agree to put up a new one. So I guess the progress. I guess progress in Catholic. What's that? Maybe, yeah, maybe he's on an extended vacation. Maybe. So that's just if you ever do a Holy Land tour, I'm sure you'll hear that story, and I get such a kick out of it that I had to mention that before we start the church tour. And so imagine that we're walking through that entrance. We go through, and on the right there's a steep little staircase, steep narrow staircase, and you climb up it, and you reach a little chapel that marks the traditional location of Calvary. And there's actually a hole in the decorative facade where you can reach down and touch the stone where traditionally Jesus was crucified. And actually under the hill of Calvary, there's a little hill, it is a hill, there's a little cavern, and some people have identified that as the tomb of Adam. You know, the very first man who was responsible for the fall. And so some theologians have suggested that his bones were deposited there somehow, and that Jesus' blood flowed down and consecrated those bones. And so, being that he was like a new Adam who washed away original sin, people have told that story of this actually being the resting place of Adam's bones. Now, I don't really believe that. That's one of those things that I don't think it's literally true, but I think theologically, as a story about the impact of Jesus' sacrifice, I think it is very true in that sense. And so even if it's not literally true, it's still quite poignant. And so I think it's a neat story, neat tradition. So you go down another set of stairs to descend the hill of Calvary, and then you hang a left. And then you see the orange rectangle on the plan in kind of the front entrance court. So that's the next thing you'll visit. And that is the traditional location of where Jesus' body was prepared for burial. And there's this slab of stone that many people venerate as the stone where Jesus was actually prepared for burial. And many people will kneel and pray and touch it. And it's common to take a piece of jewelry or an icon or various things and touch it to the stone just to have that connection with it. Which I don't know if I really believe that that's the actual stone, but I still think that's a beautiful tradition. I actually bought Michelle a Jerusalem cross once, and I laid it on the stone and prayed over it, because I certainly don't think there's anything wrong with that tradition, even if it's not literally true. But you can see that little cross if you want to come up after the talk. But so you continue past that stone, and you'll approach the rotunda, which was originally built by Constantine. Most of that is long gone. It's been rebuilt so many times. Let's see. I think my slideshow is not progressing for some reason. We're having some technical difficulties this week. Okay, I think it's working now. All right, we're back. So you proceed to the rotunda, the basic footprint of which dates back to Constantine's time. And that's where the actual tomb is. And this is where I really think it's legit. The other ones are tradition, and I feel like the precise spot might have shifted over the centuries, and it's much less distinctive. But I really think that this was Jesus' tomb. And so I'll explain what you're looking at. This is looking down from the top of the rotunda at this, this little shrine, and the shrine is the actual tomb. And you can still go in it and visit it and pray in there. And inside the tomb is space for 3 or 4 people to kneel side by side and pray and reflect. And usually when you go there, it's crowded. There's maybe hundreds of people there. And you might wait an hour to get into the tomb, and you might have 3 seconds before some priest is semi-politely telling you to move along. And so that's another reason why I think a lot of people struggle with this site, because it all feels kind of hectic. But one time I was in Jerusalem. I was spending a couple nights there before going on a dig, and I was getting over jet lag, and so I woke up really early in the morning and went for a walk in the old city. And spontaneously, I happened to walk up to this church right as they were unlocking the doors. And so I got to be the first person to walk into this church in the morning. And there's maybe 3 or 4 people with me going in at the same time. Like the priests are still lighting the lamps and everything. And so I went to the tomb and was the only one there, and I got to kneel and pray and reflect for several minutes. I mean, far longer than I'd ever had time to before. And I was overwhelmed with the history of the place and just feeling that. And I felt what I interpret as the presence of the Holy Spirit. And that was the closest I've ever come to a John Wesley type heart strangely warmed moment. And it was in this church, in this tomb. So take that for what it's worth. That makes this church all the more special for me. Maybe I was overwhelmed by the history and the beauty and the pageantry, which appeals to me, in the same way that other people have been overwhelmed by the simplicity and the peace of the garden tomb. So I don't know, God speaks to us differently, but that felt real to me, and this church will always be my favorite church in Christendom for that reason. And so back to more of the history and archaeology stuff. A lot of distractions today. We'll get through it, though, don't worry. So 5 or 10 years ago, the churches did a conservation project on the Holy Sepulchre. You know, like I said, it's an ancient church, and sometimes it needs spruced up and stabilized and reevaluated. And when they did that, they removed the current decorative slab that is basically a reliquary over the traditional site of Jesus' burial. And under the decorative slab, they found a simple burial slab of the type used in first century Jewish tombs. Exactly what we would expect in Jesus's tomb. And so unlike the other tomb that most people interpret as a 7th or 8th century BC tomb, this one holds up. It's at least the right style, appears to be the right period. And so that was a pretty cool detail that you don't get very many opportunities to do any kind of archaeological work in these holy sites because they're active holy sites. But in the course of this restoration, they got a team in there and they found that detail. They also found several other first century Jewish style tombs in the vicinity, which I'll point those out on the plan here in a minute. But I want to address something that may have occurred to some of you, which is that thing does not look like a tomb carved out of a cliff, which is what the Gospels seem to describe. And so that would seem to count against it, except that when Constantine built the church, he seems to have had the cliff cut away from around the tomb, leaving it standing as a little shrine, roughly what we see today. And we can see an ancient example of a similar thing happening. You've seen the tomb on the right before from one of my previous lectures, if you were here for that. But that is a first century Jewish tomb that was carved fairly similarly. There they took the natural cliff face and they carved out around the tomb, leaving a freestanding little shrine. And so a lot of people think that something similar occurred with the Holy Sepulchre, and that with that shrine, which is called the Aedicule. And so that's why, rather than a tomb carved into a cliff like we would expect, we now have this little freestanding shrine. So then, behind the rotunda, you might be able to barely see on the plan, there's a row of little burial niches. So it says tombs there on the back of the rotunda. Those are the other first century Jewish tombs. And so there's significant evidence that this was indeed a first century Jewish burial ground. So far, everything really holds up, at least I think a lot stronger than the Garden Tomb. And so from there, we continue around the central chapel. So imagine you're going through the rotunda to the right and going down this hallway. Now you'll encounter a set of stairs, and going down the stairs, you'll enter this chapel, the Chapel of St. Helena, and this is where she sat when she found what she believed to be the true cross. And again, it's hard to say that for sure if that was the true cross. As I understand it, Romans reused crosses So they wouldn't have like turned it over to the apostles. So I am skeptical of whether or not it was the true cross, but it may well have been a cross, which still is evidence in favor of this being the site of crucifixions, including Jesus' crucifixion. And it's at least possible, if maybe not plausible, that this really was the true cross of Jesus that St. Helena found here. So you can visit this little chapel and see the actual cave where the cross is said to have been found. But that's another cool little detail from this church. So all that to say, I think the traditional Church of the Holy Sepulchre is the more likely spot. Much stronger historical and archaeological evidence. But by all means, don't let that spoil the garden tomb for you if you ever go to Jerusalem. It's also worth a visit. So, going back to, I hope all that architecture and plans and all that wasn't too boring. But now we go back to the gospel stories. And after Jesus is resurrected, the first person to encounter him was his disciple Mary. And we have this brief little account in John where she doesn't recognize him until he calls her by name, and then she turns and cries out Rabboni, which means teacher in Aramaic. And I think that is so cool for a couple of reasons. One, I think it's really neat that the first person to encounter the risen Jesus, essentially the first person to hear and share the gospel, was a woman. And so for anyone who doesn't accept women in leadership in the church, I think they have to grapple with why God chose to have a woman be the first person to share the gospel in history. So I think that's a cool detail. But then I just love her response. Like you can just picture her crying out, "Teacher," that I think reflects the intimacy and love and familiarity between Jesus and the apostles. And so that little account, it's brief and there's not that much detail, but it has just always really spoke to me for those reasons. And so after this, she tells the other apostles that he'll meet them in Galilee, and he appears to them. We have the Great Commission where they're sent out to the world to preach the gospel. And then, about a month later, we have Pentecost, where the Holy Spirit descended on the church. And it's easy, when we hear about speaking in tongues, it's easy to focus on like the tongues of angels because that seems so much more exotic. But I think it's really cool that at Pentecost, all the people in Jerusalem from all different nations were able to hear the apostles in their own languages. I think that's a way more, at least for me, that's a more impactful testament of the gospel than the idea of speaking in tongues of angels, because I think that reflects God's plan for the gospel to spread to the whole world. And throughout this series, we've seen how God started by singling out a man to be the foundation of his people. And the man grew into a family, the family grew into a tribe, the tribe grew into a nation, the nation grew into a kingdom. And so we got to see how God interacts on all those different levels becoming more and more expansive and inclusive at every stage. And now it's no longer limited to one people, one ethnicity. We have the gospel that is being shared with all humanity. And so I think that is such a beautiful part of Pentecost, more so even than the miraculous elements, is the news of the gospel being available to all people, regardless of race and ethnicity and nationality and all these things that can divide us. And so that makes me think back to when Jesus took the disciples to Caesarea Philippi and told Peter that he would be the rock on which the church would be built, and the gates of hell would not prevail against it. And if you were here last week, you may remember how this behind me in the picture is the Grotto of Pan that the Romans associated with an opening to the underworld. And so it's associated with dark powers, and it's associated with Rome, who were imperial conquerors who were holding Judea captive, essentially. And I think it's very significant that Jesus chose this as the setting to tell Peter that he would be the rock of his church. Because when he says that the gates of hell will not prevail over it, I think he's associating that with the powers of the principalities that were embodied by the Roman Empire. The ultimate expression of almost the cult of statehood and the cult of power, and almost a death cult that is maybe the ultimate statement of the worldly powers and principalities that the church has to contend with. And so I think all of that was, I hate to speak for Jesus, because I certainly don't have that authority, but I can't help but think that something like that was in his mind, that he knew that the church was going to be going against this cult of power, and that it was going to seem impossible to prevail against it. And yet they did. Not only did they prevail against it, but it was precisely because of the relative stability of the Roman Empire and their famous roads that facilitated travel and commerce between all the cities they controlled, that the gospel was able to quickly spread throughout the whole Mediterranean and the British Isles. And by the 4th century, the whole region was significantly Christian. The gospel had reached the whole known world, at least from the perspective of the Roman Empire. And so it was this very pagan power that the church contended against that created the setting for the spread of the early church. And so then in the early 4th century, we have Constantine, who becomes Christian himself, and the empire itself is turned to Christendom. And so, of course, then from there it's history. We get to our time. But I think that's all really cool to think about, how God works in ways that we would never anticipate. I mean, I think if I would have been a 1st century Judean, I probably would have sympathized with the Sicarii and wanted to stick knives between some Roman ribs. And I probably would have struggled to see how God would use that for furthering his kingdom. And yet he did. And in a few hundred years, the gospel had spread from one people in one little bitty, seemingly insignificant country to the whole known world. And so that's what we're looking forward to as we finish up Lent and look forward to Easter and Pentecost, is the power of the gospel and the power to overcome the world and to work in ways that we would never anticipate, but that ultimately works to the glory of God. And so I think that's a good place to end it. And hopefully I didn't get too boring about all of the little details of architecture and whatnot that I'm really nerdy about. So thanks for being patient with that, and thanks for being patient with our technical difficulties. And so now we'll open it up to any questions that you might have. Mm-hmm. She asked, where am I getting my doctorate? It's through Lipscomb University in Nashville. So it's a PhD in ancient Near Eastern archaeology. Mm-hmm.
John, did I understand correctly that your previous sessions
Yeah, that's right. So she asked if this and previous sessions are available online, and they're available through the church's YouTube channel. At least that's where I've been able to access them. Oh, thank you. Mm-hmm. I'm glad you liked it.
The Gospel of John specifically calls out that the tomb had never been used,
Mm-hmm.
which I presume means somebody thought that fact was important.
Yeah.
And so I can imagine space becomes an issue. Burying more people in a tomb, or do they take them out and put them somewhere else?
So sometimes. So I'm repeating questions because they aren't usually picked up on the mic. So he asked about the significance of that being an unused tomb, and why was that significant, and what were the burial practices, and did they run out of space, and what was done in that instance? Space was an issue, and that probably is why that was specified. And actually, in this same period, it became common to have like a communal family tomb where a body would be laid out and left to decompose. And then later, the bones would be collected in a small box called an ossuary, and which is only about the size of like a moving box, not even that big. But then that would be stored in order to conserve space. The question is, were people buried in the ground? I'm sure they were.
Like the lady that found
Mm-hmm.
Baldwin in
Yeah, I'm sure there were instances of just simple burials where people are buried directly in the ground. But I think most of what we find is the more elaborate tombs, just because that's what's preserved. But I'm not sure. When I talk about rock-cut tombs and ossuaries, I think that is probably a bit more affluent. People who were a bit more affluent. I don't know what a burial for, say, a very poor Jewish person or a very poor Roman person would have looked like. I suspect it probably would have just been a simple internment into the ground. Sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you. And I mean, I definitely feel blessed to have experienced that because I've been to Israel and Palestine, I think, 10 times, and I've stayed in Jerusalem more times than I can count because I often stay there before and after a trip, and sometimes even during a dig, we'll leave where we're staying on the weekends and go to Jerusalem. So I've probably stayed in Jerusalem maybe 40 or 50 times. And so that, I mean, that's been such a blessing, and hopefully that familiarity I've gotten from that has helped me make this more interesting and accessible. Yeah. Great question. How much bigger is Jerusalem now versus back then? Uh, Yeah. Also, is the Wailing Wall or the Western Wall from back then? Modern Jerusalem is much, much bigger than the Old City. The Old City, you can walk across it in maybe in less than an hour. Um, and you could walk all the way around it in maybe few hours. And so it's quite small, the ancient walled city. Whereas the modern city is a sprawling, I don't know how many people live there, but it's a large, fairly modern city that sprawls out much farther than the ancient city did. Hmm. Oh, yeah, yeah. And the Western Wall, or the Wailing Wall, did date back to the 1st century. That was part of the temple complex built by Herod the Great that would have been there when Jesus was on earth. Mm-hmm. Yep, yep. So the question was about Hadrian, and the Hadrian who built the temple, I believe, was the same emperor who built the wall in England, between England and Scotland. Mm. Mm. Yeah. Oh, that's great. Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Oh, that's cool. Yeah. Steve Ortiz is my doctoral advisor. So he's the primary reader for my dissertation that I'm going to be defending a week from tomorrow. So
We'll keep that in your prayers. So it's all written?
yeah, for the draft anyway. We'll see how many edits they have.
So we need to put you on our prayer list.
I would appreciate that. Yeah.
Your wife showed how thick it was?
I don't really know. She asked if I'm planning to teach. I would like to teach in some capacity. I've taught as an adjunct for Indiana Wesleyan University, and I'll probably continue to do that to some extent. They have, in the past, they've had a class on site where students go over to Israel and spend a couple weeks on a dig and learn how to do archaeology in the field. And I've taught that part of that class. So hopefully I'll continue to teach that, but with current events being the way they have been, I haven't been able to do that for several years. So I'd like to continue doing that, and then hopefully I'll have other teaching opportunities. I don't know if it'll be a full-time thing or if it'll just be adjunct teaching here and there. We're continuing to do stuff like this. But yeah, hopefully I'll be doing some sort of teaching after I finish my degree. I'd like to, yeah. I'd like to keep going on digs. It's been a few years because the last time I was in the field was in Sudan, and then the civil war there broke out, and so that I wasn't going back there. And then Israel hasn't been ideal for travel either, so yeah, it's kind of tricky to try to work in that part of the world. How old was I? I was I was in my 20s or early 30s. So I'm not sure when that was taken. I was probably 25 or 30. Mm-hmm.
How do they handle like new development? Do they develop on top of that? Do they survey it beforehand?
Yeah, it's complicated. Talking about what's it like to build in current day Jerusalem, right? It's very hard to build in the old city, and if you're able to, I suspect that it's almost you're almost invariably going to have a salvage excavation of some kind if you're going to break ground. And even more broadly, it's very common to have to do a salvage excavation. And in some cases, probably they have to halt building altogether. Because it's very complicated to build in a city that has been continually occupied for over 3,000 years, especially for a culture that has an interest in its own history like that. So yeah, it's very complicated. I don't fully understand all the intricacies of it, but yeah, it's...
Several different cultures.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any other questions? If we don't, I'll wrap it up, and anybody's welcome to come up and talk to me one-on-one. I also have a few little artifacts and souvenirs that might interest you to look at, so you're welcome to come see that.
So I would be remiss if we did not pray over John, because the work that he's doing is big, and it's major, and dissertations are scary. Yeah.
It is, yeah.
Because you have to defend them, right, to a bunch of people who know the work that you've done. And why are you doing it? Have you thought about this? Have you read? I mean, it's a lot. So the fact that you're here and it's time to defend is big news.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really kind of cool that you'll defend it during Holy Week.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a double cool thing. So if anyone would like to come up, we're going to pray over John and just ask that God will steady him and bring him peace, give him the right words to say. We're going to send him to his dissertation covered in prayer. So let's do that.
Oh, thank you.